what does it mean to practice and embody right speech? And how can our words lead to flourishing or to ruin? These are some of the questions I'm excited to discuss with author, poet, curator, photographer, and editor Shin Yu Pai in this conversation about the classical Tamil masterpiece on ethics, power, and love, the Kural, or in short, the Kural. I'm Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma, and after 15 years of preparation that I didn't realize was preparation, I have spent the last 5 years translating this work into English. Because this is a work of world literature and of wisdom literature, which is on par with works like the Tao Te Ching or the poetry of Rumi, I've wanted to honor it and introduce it into the English-speaking world, where it remains, for a number of different reasons, not as well known as I think it ought to be. And because this is also a work which speaks so profoundly to how we practice wisdom, how we embody wisdom in our everyday lives, in the nitty-gritty of day-to-day life, I've been inviting people into conversation. Poets, artists, healers, and spiritual leaders of all kinds to discuss a handful of verses, to explore how these verses can remind us of what we know in the depths of our being, and also show us something new. I am particularly delighted to have as my guest today my friend Shin Yu Pai, whose many books have been an inspiration to me. And two of the most recent of those books are Ensō, which is a beautiful and multi-layered visual and literary and visual work, as well as a collection of poems named Virga, which explores in particular depth the very thing I'm hoping to speak about today, the aspiration toward right speech. And really, it's really a great honor to have you here today, Shin Yu. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to see you.
It's lovely to see you too. In thinking about right speech, there are actually a number of chapters in the Kural which deal directly with this topic. The Kural is divided into 133 chapters, each of which consists of 10 short verses on a specific topic. And so, in fact, there's a chapter on the sweetness of speech, and what does that actually mean? There's a chapter on what does it mean to have strength in one's speech. There's a chapter on not being afraid of an audience. There's a chapter on knowing an audience. And so going back and forth with Shin Yu, we looked at some of these chapters and we came to one in particular that I think is particularly relevant and I think will be very interesting for us to speak about. And I think that Shin Yu may have some very important things to say, very interesting things to say. And this is a chapter on which I've translated the title as Freedom from Fruitless Speech. Freedom from speech that doesn't lead to a noble end, doesn't lead to some result that serves goodness, that serves the well-being of a community and our community of communities. And so I've shared this chapter with Shin Yu, and she sat with it. And I'll be curious to explore, a small number, 2, 3 of these verses and see what kinds of thoughts, insights, questions they provoke. So my first question really is, of these verses, is there one in particular that stood out to you, either on your first reading or in sitting with the verses?
Yeah, absolutely. And the frame of kind of reading this particular chapter, it's impossible to do without looking at it through the lens of poetry, right? So I'm noticing the diction and the word choices that you're making and this kind of repetition of this imagery of fruit. So the couplet that really stood out for me was the verse number 199, which makes no mention at all of fruit. Those who see truth with clear eyes never lapse into words without meaning. So that one really, really stood out for me, I think, in terms of it breaking from that convention or shattering form, but also I think in its message as well. And that following verse as well that closes out this chapter, speak speech that bears fruit, never speech that bears nothing. that one also really stood out for me in terms of it being like a call to action, I guess, which isn't always something that is in poems, but felt like something to pay attention to as a reader.
It's really beautiful. Um, the the 10th poem of this group for me too is a very important one because of it. This call, as you say, into action and into bringing our ideals, bringing our principles into our acts, into our deeds, at the smallest level and as at the largest level. Um, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about this, the second to last of these verses. Those who see truth with clear eyes never lapse into words without meaning. Because I guess what I'm curious about is, as a poet yourself and as a very, I think very, very beautiful a poet with really what I admire in your work is your keen sense of what does it mean for a word to be meaningful? What does it mean? What does it mean to speak something or to not speak something? When are we to speak? When are we to be silent? And so I'd be curious to know how, to what extent you may see something of your own experience.
So that line, those who see truth with clear eyes never lapse into words without meaning. I think for me, these lines are so evocative of the notion of like clear seeing, ability to connect to experience precedes any kind of language. Like without that ability to have that clarity, the words don't have any chance of really having any meaning, because if they're emerging first before looking, they're already within a kind of mental construct or imposition upon the thing that's being encountered or experienced. And so these particular verses, I think, speak to me about the order of experience in some ways. It's like the connecting to the emergence of an experience or a phenomena or an emotion before language arises is ideally the place that we can best sort of occupy experience.
That's beautiful. There is, as you're speaking, I'm struck by the way that the poet Thiruvalluvar, um, there's a whole chapter in the Kural on listening and the art of listening. But here, of course, there's a focus on vision and on
Mhm.
sight, those who see truth with clear eyes, in the sense of what does it mean to have a clear vision, to have clear eyes, and how the sight and the speaking are so deeply connected, and how the capacity in a sense, to listen with the eyes or to witness with the eyes, and then listen for how does what one has seen, want to be expressed in words. There's such a beautiful sense of how these two things are so deeply connected. Um,
Absolutely.
that's really beautiful.
And I think especially for poets, like you and I, working so closely with image often in our poems, that really it's almost like it's not even about like finding the right words necessarily, but that listening to the image and how it wants to be expressed, I feel like is the way that I'm guided to let the poem free on the page.
Mm, that's beautiful. I was just reading an interesting essay by the Canadian poet Robert Bringhurst, and he speaks too about, he was talking about storytellers, and how, when a storyteller has really heard a story, they have seen the story. And so that their telling becomes the telling from that witnessing of what they have seen. And so that
Mm.
although the words may change in various tellings depending on who's there in the audience and who is listening, the circumstances, the times, the story itself is coming from that vision, from that sight. And in fact, one of the things that I have long noted about not just Thiruvalluvar, but among many of the great classical Tamil poets is this sense that people of wisdom are also people of vision. They are people who have that capacity for um, perception, for seeing. There is, in fact, another chapter in the Kural which is on the ability to see what people are not saying, to read their faces, to read their gestures. And in this chapter, the context is very actually strongly not only suggesting, but saying directly that a leader, whatever kind, needs to have such people at her side, his side, their side, people who can perceive these things. And then perhaps when the time comes, put them into words so that we can connect with that sight. We can honor it. We can learn how to see it.
There were a couple of things that you said that I wanted to like appreciate, I think, for a moment or just kind of reflect on. So in talking about the Robert Bringhurst and, you know, how he talks broadly of like the craft of storytelling and how it encompasses not just like the moment of the way in which the person sees the experience or the story, but also who he's sharing that work with. There's so much there about that Buddhist notion of expedient means, right? And that it's closely aligned with right speech, but that notion that the teaching or the wisdom is expressed in the way that the community, the student needs to hear it, and something that is kind of synthesized, I think, in the storyteller or the poet in terms of that ability to impart the truth. You also talked a little bit about this notion of when be silent. And yeah, I don't know, this is one that maybe I think about more than I used to. And I don't know if it's something that you would be interested in kind of engaging with, I suppose, a little bit. But, you know, I think about like my cultural roots, you know, being the child of like, you know, Asian American immigrants, Asian immigrants from Taiwan, and being a female daughter and having certain kinds of cultural gender expectations surrounding this notion of silence, you know. And I don't know if I don't know if you were a firstborn son or if there were certain qualities of culture that you also had inherited or imposed upon you in terms of how you express yourself in the world. But I feel like this topic of silence is very interesting because in my poems, sometimes I choose to be silent and not say it all. And I think that in the evolution of my work, I've had to work very hard to go beyond silence in some ways, in terms of saying the thing that's truthful, that's really important to say. But then also there's this kind of also like a dichotomy in terms of like coming from a more Buddhist perspective, like going beyond silence sometimes is like it's like a different level or layer of silence in some ways. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but it's also this notion that language can't point to everything or experience, you know. So I'd love to talk to you about silence as somebody who uses words as their medium. Like, you know, what is silence to you?
That's a beautiful, beautiful question. With so many layers and aspects to it. I was, in fact, the firstborn son in my family, and with that came some I would have to say advantages and disadvantages of being in such a position. Both my sister and I have, you know, are continuing our own journey with sorting through all of what it means to be who we particularly are, born into those particular circumstances. In my case, with my mother's family tracing its roots to Okinawa, and my father's family tracing its roots to northern Netherlands, to Friesland, and making sense of all of the riches of those lineages, those heritage, and the confusion that it can cause, even the noise, if you will, that it can cause, like the noise I can hear of a plane passing overhead. And, you know, one of the interesting things about the Kural is there's such a sense of being, of a certain kind of openness, being able to attend to what we see, being able to hear what we hear, both beautiful things and maybe things that we might not think of as beautiful, like, oh, the plane going overhead, or whatever it may be. The king, for instance, or the leader, the archetypal leader, one of the qualities that such a leader is supposed to look for in the circle of advisors that they draw around them are people who are able to thunder, people who are able to call the leader on, you know, point out to the leader and to everybody there where things may have gone wrong, where there may have been a lapse in judgment, where things may have been carried out poorly. And so, for me personally, there is this great question about silence, because I, on the one hand, am very comfortable and have worked to cultivate the ability to listen in silence, not only to words, but to silence, or to the silence around words, and to be attentive to the silence out of which words come. But on the other hand, there have been times in my life when I have felt the impulse to speak and I haven't spoken. I have been more comfortable remaining silent and perhaps not risking creating any thunder or risking disturbing the waters. And then, after these moments have passed, maybe a day later or a week later, or sometimes much later, I thought, I wonder what would have happened had I spoken. I wonder if that would have changed things, or maybe it was right to stay silent. And that's always an open question. And so, this brings me back to the 10th of these verses that you mentioned earlier, because, we can read each of these verses as an individual verse, and we can read them as a verse within a chapter, but we can also see where have they been placed in the chapter, and what sort of silent clues does that offer us as readers or as listeners as to how to read, how to hear what it has to say. And it's often the case that the last verse of the chapters is both a kind of summation or conclusion, but also sort of points forward to the next chapter. And in this case, I'm struck by the two injunctions here. And I'll read the verse again. This is the 10th of these verses. Speak speech that bears fruit, never speech that bears nothing. And in fact, I have I think I have the tummer for this particular verse with me, so we can I'll share that too, so we can hear what that sounds like. Solga solir bayanurea, solarka solir bayanela chol. Speak speech that bears fruit, never speech that bears nothing. And what is so interesting to me, reflecting on it now in this very moment with you and your observations and questions and thoughts, is that, there are times where it will not be useful, fruitful to speak. There are times where silence, in fact, is more powerful, and I've witnessed those, and I know many people, other people who have. But there is also with that this paired injunction to speak speech that bears fruit. And I never thought of it this way before, but it's as if to say, if you have something that may be fruitful, that may lead to some end which is a good, then you must speak it. Then you are being asked to speak it, that you're given this opportunity to practice that kind of speaking, that kind of witnessing, that kind of embodied poetry. And so the verse, in a sense, sort of is right there on that very question you're asking. When do we stay silent? When do we speak? And how do we know? And of course, the verse doesn't tell us how we know, unless we start to look at the other verses around us, and then we start to look at our own hearts and where and to listen to the silence or the silent sounds within our own hearts that may be telling us, yeah, maybe it's time to say something here, or I know you really want to say that thing, but maybe it's not time to say that thing. So there's something here about that point of decision, or that point of commitment between silence and speech. And I'm curious if any of those ramblings or musings provoke thoughts or invoke thoughts for you.
Well, I think that maybe part of what is also embedded in this chapter as a value is that idea of discriminating awareness. Like, that's the very quality that can play that role in determining when to thunder or when to say stay silent. And I had really focused on looking at this chapter without looking at the ones around it. But, I can look at the sort of facing page, and, the next chapter is about fear of doing harm, which, unless we have that discriminating awareness, we can't allow ourselves to be vocal and articulate. And so
Yeah.
it's helpful for me to look beyond just kind of like the chapter and feel the kind of greater context of where it lies. I feel like too, like listening to you talk a little bit about this verse and the book in general. Um, you know, when you told me about this project and the limited interaction I've had with it, I thought a bit of it. In some ways, I thought it would be maybe more like your Avayar translations, kind of like this compendium of verses related to how to live and to be human in the world. And as I hear you talk about it more, I almost feel or wonder if this is also this text for like kings and leaders, right? Like when we think of the Bhagavad Gita, right? And that story being about, warriorship and duty, right? I think likewise, I have read or experienced interpretations of the Tao Te Ching as not just a Taoist spiritual text, but being one around like managing warfare in kingdoms. And I think that was maybe a context which I wasn't entirely prepared for in reading these verses. And I didn't find them all quite as accessible as the tone of Avayar, which was a collection of ancient women poets. And so that completely makes sense. Like if the audience for this was really geared towards thinking about leadership in really difficult times, like absolutely I would, feel more resonant with the earlier work that you've done. But I think hearing about that context of aspiration and nobility is really interesting.
There's a way in which the entire work offers itself in so many different ways. This, just for example, this chapter we've been talking about comes from the first of the three parts, which we could say would be ethics or virtue, power or prosperity and wealth, and then love, relatedness, romantic relatedness in its various forms. And so one can read the chapter as being about personal ethics or personal duty or virtue. And one can also, as I think you very astutely felt and noticed, in the context of, how such a person might grow to be a leader. And in fact, one of the things that makes the book, I think, continue to speak is that it can be read very practically as a guide to leaders, even in a context which may be very different from the original context in which the verses were written. And at the same time, there is this extraordinary multiplicity that even verses that might be speaking of a leader, of a king, of a sovereign, might also apply in some unexpected way to the life of a household, or to the life of a student or a poet or a scholar or an artist, or an accountant, all of these different things. And that each verse has a kind of integrity and independence that can be invoked and can be used to explore some particular terrain of experience, but can also be a doorway to the work as a whole and sort of be in dialogue with all of these other verses. And that what I've found is that often when something comes in the form of a book and it's bound and it has a kind of unitary quality to it, and someone might think, well, to read this book, I start at the beginning, I go to the end, and I see what is the overall argument say of the work. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. That's quite noble and admirable admiration, admirable intention. And at the same time, there's also a way in which a work like this, particularly as a poem or as a poem of many poems, offers this other possibility of maybe there are 5 verses of the 1,330 verses that speak to a particular person. And they may speak to that particular person profoundly enough. They don't need any of the other verses. And those 5 verses become for them their own unique Kural, their own what Tirbaluwar, what this whole poetic tradition has to say to them. And of course, for me, different verses resonate differently and speak to me differently, and that changes over time. And there have been times where I've been much more drawn, for instance, to the verses on ethics or on political arrangement of community life. And there's also been times where I've been just floored by the verses on love. Um, and so it's a companion, right? It's a companion in the sense that one can bring it with them if they want, through alongside other works that they may have with them through their life journey, and then different parts will speak perhaps at the exact times that they need to speak in the ways that they need to speak. And I think that's one of the things that makes it particularly special, because it's not saying here's how everybody should be, period, but rather here's a whole almost overwhelming panoramic view of many different life paths which nonetheless interconnect, and may even seem to contradict each other, and yet there is a greater integrity beyond them in which they do connect. And so, having lived with this work for the time that I have lived with it, I've come to see more and more and to appreciate more and more how these different layers, these different elements are in dialogue with each other.
Yeah, it's almost as if the structure of the book lends itself to the experience of these different lessons at different times in one sort of experience, almost like taking a koan, and this is the one that I'm living with right now that resonates within me, but then you maybe master it, or you move on to the next kind of question or puzzle. This is not necessarily related to what we're talking about, but I will say that I have read some of these verses to my 8-year-old, and also your Abiyar poems, and it's really interesting, I think, to share these kinds of instructions on living with like a young person, because the language is so straightforward, as well as kind of the lesson that's being imparted, and that's kind of, I don't know, really magical to be able to like share that with somebody so young, and to have that so accessible, to be able to explain to him, the kind of message of these chapters or verses, that he can kind of carry them in him and think about the ways in which he might want to move through the world living these lessons.
Well, that's so beautiful. There is, in fact, a long tradition in the South Indian state of Tamil Nadu, where Tamar dwells, of young people, in fact, memorizing 10 verses, 20 verses, maybe even the whole thing, the most precocious and ambitious of them. And so people will enter in at a very young age. And this is true also of Avoyard's poems. And they'll engage with these poems at a young age and see certain things, and maybe one or two of them will stay with them. And then 10 years later, 20 years later, they'll remember this one particular poem, and they may learn something new from it, or they may have something to say back to it. So I really love that you would do that, and read that with him, and share them, and explore that, because I think they are meant to be hearable by people of all kinds, young and old alike. We have this strange division, oftentimes, at least in North America, between sort of quote unquote children's literature and quote unquote sort of adult literature. And in fact, this division is often illusory. There are many so-called children's books which are saying much more profound things than some of the so-called adult books, in more playful and memorable ways. And so there's something about that potential, or that quality of a certain kind of poetry, which can touch us wherever we may find ourselves in our lives. And I think that's really something beautiful. And I'm curious if there are any other verses in this chapter that interested you or caught your eye, or if there are any other questions you might have for me about my own experience with these poems, or with translating these poems.
I think there were phrases, throughout some of these couplets that really, they gave me a lot to think about. Fruitless and denatured words. I thought that was a very powerful phrasing. Worse than the heartlessness to friends. Husk of a man. these were all such kind of strong, evocative images of um, words that have been, abused and don't point to meaning in a lot of ways. The metaphor of fruit and fruitlessness is one that's interesting to me. Um, this chapter is very much about the dangers of the misuse of speech, right? And its toxic impacts in a lot of way. And maybe it would be interesting to hear you um, talk about this metaphor of fruit. And I mean, it's quite silly, but when I first started reading this chapter and thinking about, gosh, how am I going to talk to my friend Thomas about this? I just I focused on the fruit, and I thought a lot about how I don't know, like a lot of Asian families, fruit is like this really big deal in terms of like expressing love, right? Like this might be familiar to you if you had one of those mothers that was big into like just showing up at your door with like a bowl of beautiful cut fruit or something. And there's like so much nostalgia around like this notion of fruit for like, young Asian Americans, it's like a symbol of like a mother's love or something. And so I don't know, it's like it made me think a lot about, but we're flipping that. This is like the complete opposite of, that kind of like mother's love or experience or integrity, right? Taking this really beautiful, popular, nourishing image and kind of like turning it into something like rotten and like visceral. And I'm really curious about that choice of words, like that evocation that you landed on.
That's a wonderful and beautiful question. The word I've been translating as fruit means a number of different things, and of course, this is one of the great challenges in translating a work like this: is how do we choose which word? Somebody might say a more direct or literal translation would be rather than fruit to say result or proper end or noble goal or something like that. But part of my task, as I've understood it, in approaching this translation, is to render the poems in such a way that they can be poems. And part of the work of a poem is to evoke, to bring associations through the words themselves. And so part of my reasoning behind using the word fruit as an image for the ripening of something, the result of a long process which involves soil and sun and seed and water, comes from the fact that there's another chapter on the sweetness of speech. And the sweetness of speech has to do with, of course, in English, we have this phrase like to sweet talk someone or something, which has a totally different connotation. And so there's, a whole different landscape to navigate there. But the root meaning is, words can offer a sweetness, but it is the sweetness of truth. It is the sweetness of goodness. It's the sweetness of
Yeah.
a kind of integrity. So in fact, as you were speaking, I was remembering the 10th verse from that chapter, where Tervalvar says, speaking without sweetness, sweet words within, like finding ripe fruit and eating sour. This image of how, just as if we have thunder within us, we may to speak out, and we hold that back. There's, we're sort of holding back that capacity for change in the world. Here, we may have that sweetness in our hearts. We may have a sweet, life-giving thought to offer, and if we hold it back, it's like you have all this ripe fruit, and rather than eating the ripe fruit, you take the unripe, the still sour, the still green, the still difficult to chew fruit. And so, in a way, what I've tried to do is to create a fabric so that these, through the choices of words, and this is going on in the original, we're sort of remembering, oh yeah, there was the fruit in that other chapter, and so this is like that in the sense of being able to offer something that's matured, that has been carried out to its natural conclusion, to its fullest sweetness, to use that word.
And that chapter comes earlier, yeah, the one that you're speaking of regarding sweetness. Like that's so interesting that it re-arises, through your translation and its placement in the sequence, which is like like the concept had time to like mature in the reader, and then
Mm,
reappear and reemerge as riper fruit.
that's
Um,
beautifully put.
yeah, I do love that particular diction, because um, yeah, speech is so slippery, right? The notion of kind of like honeyed words that are not the same as the sweetness of integrity. And there's just a, a beautiful take on it, I think, that incorporates, yeah, so much more thoughtfulness around, yeah, not just the meaning of words, but something about, I don't know, the power of their origins, their intentions, where
Yeah.
they come from. Yeah.
And there is also, uh, throughout this particular work, a deep ecological sensibility. The first chapter is on, we could say, God or the gods or the godlike qualities of great teachers. And the very second chapter is on rain and the necessity of rain, and not just as a metaphor, but as an actual substance falling from the heavens to nourish the actual food that we need to eat. And so that kind of understanding of the interrelatedness of all things, natural, particularly our natural material experience, informs everything through here. And I think that was sort of playing into my decision to use the word fruit in particular for this chapter. Because you're a poet, I think you will understand the sort of dilemma that I've had, which is that, if we look at these poems word for word in, say, the original language, in Tamil and in English, one can have endless debates about which word corresponds to which word. And there's no right answer, and there's no end to such debates, because no word is ever the same in one language and another. There will always be some layer of meaning that's not captured. And so whatever one word you might choose, you're choosing against something else. But as a poet, I think you probably have experienced what I've experienced as a poet, which is that poetry isn't about one-to-one correspondence of words. Poetry is about this other thing that happens when words and silence and rhythm come together, so that there are groups of words. I love that you were remembering certain phrases. I mean, that I think is characteristic of poetry, that a certain phrase will evoke an image, a memory, a connotation. And it's at the level of how words are being woven together that the poetry happens. And so my aspiration with this translation has been to weave the words in the English together in such a way that they evoke something at least similar to what the work in the original is doing, so that there's a fabric, a interweaving that corresponds with the different verses as wholes, but then also corresponds with the other chapters and the other the work as a whole. And so that the poetry is found at that level, this larger level of interconnectedness, of interbeing, to use the word from Thich Nhat Hanh, which I think is such a beautiful and profound word for this kind of relatedness.
I do appreciate this idea of the work also being very much grounded in like the ecological. It's like the verses all feel so timeless and classical and contemporary and of the moment, but I feel like it's these metaphors of the ecology that also help us to kind of connect to that timelessness as well, right? The way that people have always lived their lives, and experienced rain or different seasons. And it makes me think a bit too about my last book of poems, which was about dry thunderstorms, right? Like rain that never reaches ground. And here we have the counterpoint, the glory of rain, which is, a very powerful image. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Will you tell me about which verse is the one about thundering? I would love to, study that one maybe as my lesson.
Wow, wonderful. I would love to do that. So this is a favorite. Well, there's actually a couple places in the Kural where this idea of thundering comes into play, and one of them is thundering at the leader, and another is thundering at one's own friend. Um, in both cases, implying that friendship entails the willingness to call each other out, whether as friends, whether as political allies, or whether as the advisor, as the poet advisor to a leader. So this is coming from a chapter called Gaining the Help of the Great. It's chapter 45. And there's actually two verses right next to each other on thundering, and I'll read them both. And the first of those verses says, "Who can ruin the king who rules counsel prepared to thunder?" Who can ruin the king who rules counsel prepared to thunder? And the second of those two verses is, "An unguarded king without counsel that thunders falls even without enemies." I'll do it again. "An unguarded king without counsel that thunders falls even without enemies." And both of these verses, I think, speak so powerfully to how a leader of whatever kind needs trusted people, needs a circle of friends, a circle of wise men and women who are prepared to take a stand with their voices, who are prepared to say, I can't agree with you there. And in fact, if you do that, you're going to get yourself in some pretty bad situations, or whatever it may be. And then there's this further insight in the second verse that a leader, even who has neglected to draw a circle of advisors around them, particularly not just advisors in a general sense, but advisors who are willing to point out the errors of their ways or their decisions, such a leader falls, and they don't even need enemies to do it, because they themselves have become their own enemy. They themselves have put themselves in the position for their own faults to bring them down. And of course, we can see this, and we don't even have to look into politics. We can look at sort of the rise of certain sort of celebrities or figures in pop culture, and then you get surrounded by a bunch of people who just love them and are sort of adoring fans, and they may end up doing things that that lead to their own downfall, even without, as we say, even without sort of external enemies. So those are two verses that I think speak to that particular capacity and necessity of words to guide us, particularly if we find ourselves in the position of being a leader, or in the position of speaking to a leader, of having a leader's ear. So I wanted to thank you, Shin Yu, so much for being here, for your questions, for your insights, and most of all for your presence. I appreciate getting a chance to spend time with you whenever we have a chance to spend time together. For those of you who are interested in learning more about Shin Yu's work, you can visit her website, shinyupai.com. She is also coming out with a podcast through KUOW, the radio station KUOW, on Asian American stories. And this is a podcast I, for one, am very much looking forward to listening to and enjoying. So please do, read her books, learn about her work, look at her beautiful work. And thank you again for your attention and for your graciousness and your ear.
Thank you for the conversation, Thomas.